Good afternoon, everyone. Bienvenue tout le monde qui sont présents dans la pièce, mais également en ligne. Welcome to the Institute for Science, Society and Policy's third Grand Challenge Action Dialogue, which is a broadening and deepening of confluences, an ISSP initiative we launched last year that takes a strategic and innovative approach to knowledge mobilization at the intersection of science, society, and policy. Comme vous avez celles qui ne me connaissent pas, je m'appelle Safinger, je suis directrice de l'Institut, ainsi que professeur titulaire à l'École d'études politiques ici à l'Université. Cet événement se déroulera en anglais. Et si jamais vous avez des questions, soyez-vous bien à l'aise de les poser dans la langue de votre choix. On peut faire une traduction si nécessaire. Today we're going to begin with an Indigenous affirmation for the University of Ottawa. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada, who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. So I'm going to begin with just a little bit of an introduction to the Institute for those who aren't familiar with it. We're a cross-faculty institute at the University of Ottawa, and so we look at those intersections between science, society, and policy. So for us, some of our key themes are focused on evidence-based or evidence-informed decision-making, so AKA science for policy. We also focus on policies for science, technology, and innovation, and governance of disruptive technologies. Our strategic vision for the 2021 to 2026 period, so we're coming up to the end of our 5-year strategic plan, is to help Canada address the grand challenges of our time. And for us, of course, that is within our remit around the interface between science, society, and policy, and bringing people together across different sectors, academia, public sector, private sector, Indigenous leaders, civil society leaders. Advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion is within the ISSP's strategic plan. And that means advancing EDI within our practices as an organization, but also, and importantly, mobilizing knowledge within our network to advance EDI and to advance EDI for our members, but also for those beyond our network. So now a little bit more about Confluence's Grand Challenge Action Dialogues, which is what brings us all here together today. So the grand challenges facing society, whether it's climate change, global pandemics, inequality, they require solutions at the intersection of science, society, and policy. We know that cutting-edge research is being conducted in this space at the Institute, but there's untapped opportunity to co-produce and to mobilize this knowledge with decision makers. So last year, the Institute launched Confluences, which combines the co-creation of an annual knowledge mobilization series with an edited book on science, society, and policy. Confluences has enjoyed high levels of traction with science policymakers, with early career researchers, and with thought leaders from a variety of sectors, many of whom are in this room and online joining us today. And so this year, we launched Confluence's Grand Challenge Action Dialogues to incorporate more direct engagement with seasoned and emerging leaders on grand challenges and to broaden mobilization of knowledge of the science, society, policy interface. So today is the third Grand Challenge Action Dialogue. So as you can see here, we've addressed a number of different topics over the course of the last few dialogues. We've got a dialogue coming up at the end of February around science diplomacy. And of course, today, what brings us together is equity, diversity, and inclusion in the post-secondary research system. So this is a dialogue that has been undertaken in collaboration with the Council of Canadian Academies. We're so delighted to work with the CCA. And we'll be diving into implications for practitioners of cutting-edge research on EDI in the post-secondary research system. We will hear from the chair of the CCA's expert panel on this topic, Dr. Wendy Rogers, who you will see in a moment. And I will also share a very brief presentation about a recent ISSP report on this topic. So each of our dialogues, just to give you a sense, consists of a publicly accessible panel engagement with guest speakers, just as we're about to do here this afternoon. And that's followed by a by-invitation discussion with seasoned and emerging leaders to really dive into implications and look at how we can work together, collaborate to advance practice on that grand challenge. And we also try to incorporate meaningful opportunities for graduate students and early career researchers in this initiative as well. I'd like to thank the members of the Confluence's advisory group, some of whom are actually in the room today, including Thijs Kreutzberg, the president and CEO of the Council of Canadian Academies, who you're going to hear from in a moment. So this advisory group has really been invaluable to us in terms of framing up our work. So our agenda for today, we're just in the process of giving some welcoming remarks. Those will come from myself as head of the ISSP. We've also got some welcoming remarks from the University of Ottawa and also from the CCA. So it's now my great pleasure to turn over to Professor Awad Ibrahim, who is the University of Ottawa's Vice Provost, Equity, Diversity and Inclusive Excellence. We are so delighted that you can join us here, Professor Ibrahim. We're going to hear a few words of welcome from Dr. Ibrahim, and then we'll hear some words of welcome from Dr. Thijs Kreutzberg, CCA President and CEO, who will also introduce our guest speaker for today, as well as our moderator. So without further ado, Awad, over to you.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, everybody. I'm not going to be a hinder or standing in the middle between you and Dr. Rogers and the rest of the speakers. So I want to welcome you all at the University of Ottawa, and I'm also a professor in the Faculty of Education, where I hold the Air Canada Professor in Anti-Racism. And I was told that I only have 4 minutes, so I'm going to make 4 points really quickly. One is I'm physically going to bow my head in gratitude for our Indigenous people who did not have the choice of welcoming us, but at least they have not asked us to leave. So on that note, I want to acknowledge the land on which we call home. As we move forward, and this is something that I think we all need to keep in mind, is and as an anti-racist, I want all of us to remember EDI has to live the tension and that middle space between EDI and anti-racism. And conceptually, I want us to keep that tension alive. So EDI is not anti-racism, and anti-racism is not EDI. And there is a conceptual difference there, which it has to be kept in mind. Second point, and I'm not going to go into details because there is only 4 minutes that I have, and I'm eager to hear the rest of the speakers and the report in particular. The second point that I would love to share with you is Sonia Kang, K-A-N-G. If you don't know her work, I highly recommend looking into it. She makes 2 points that are, which will be my second and third point that I would love to make. One, EDI is not an office. So it's not a vice provost, it's not a statement that we make. In fact, it should be and looked at, if it is to be meaningful, it has to be a lived thing. So it has to be a daily struggle. It has to be a daily practice, not performance, but practices in terms of actually putting them into practice. To make EDI and anti-racism successful, the second point that she makes is that before I move on to the second point, she argues that if we think about EDI as a statement and if we approach it as an office, in fact, it becomes not only useless, but in the long run, it does more harm. because it becomes a kind of certification. I mean, it's a workshop that you attended and you have a certificate and you can put it in your office. You are an EDI certified. So it has to be thought of differently, which is something that I have seen in the report. The third point that she makes is for EDI and integration to be successful, you need leadership. You need champions, you need people like yourself, Dr. Rogers, and so on and so forth. People who are actually really serious and thinking about it and putting it into practice. And that is something I'm trying really hard to kind of plant the seeds at the University of Ottawa. To finish off, which is, I hope I'm not exceeding the 4 points. I think it's, and I'm not gonna air some dairy linen, we have visitors after all. But I wanna challenge all of us to think about this statement that I'm gonna make. We do not know who we have on campus. I think it's a bomb that should keep us sleepless. We have no idea who we have on campus. The breakdown in terms of, we have a relatively good idea in terms of gender, in terms of ability and disability. We have a relative sense of the Francophone and Anglophone. Anything else that you can aggregate as data, we have no idea of. And that is, I think, the most immediate project that desperately needs some champion at the University of Ottawa. I don't need to argue why we need the data, but I also want the institute, if at all possible, to champion it with me, especially speaking to the leadership of this university. Because, and I'm not gonna air some Gary Lehman again, there is hesitancy. And so and this is why I was so eager to read the report. And interestingly enough, with Monica, I came to know Monica through Dr. Rogers. So as soon as I got the report, I emailed Dr. Rogers and I said, at the time I didn't know you, so I said, can you come to the University of Ottawa and present this report? And she said, oh, you got Dr. Monica in the house who actually worked with us on this report. And this is when we thought, oh, great minds think alike. But it is very significant, and I think it's a way for me, if I can beg you to, a way for me to tease the university to think seriously about how do we think about EDI, not only in terms of research, but in terms of data in particular, that would help us to make informed decisions. So with that, I hope I'm not exceeding the 4 minutes. I turn it over to you. Thank you.
It's wonderful. I think we could all continue to listen for many more minutes. We have a very full program, so greatly appreciate your succinct remarks. So Tace, turning it over to you.
Merci, grand merci à vous, professeur Gettinger et professeur Ibrahim. Mon nom est Tace Kreutzberg et je suis le président et directeur général de CAC, le Conseil des académies canadiennes. Et c'est un honneur d'être ici aujourd'hui et d'être accueilli par l'Institut de recherche sur la science, la société et la politique publique. Et maintenant, l'introduction. But before I would like to convey some context for what you're about to hear today. So first off, the CCA carried out this work on behalf of the federal government at their request. And they asked for an independent expert panel assessment on what we know about measures that can enhance EDI in the post-secondary research system. And so this was actually a request from the research funders, the federal research funders, and there were 7 that asked for this. The 3 granting agencies, the Canada Foundation for Innovation, National Research Council, ISET, and Health Canada, and they were all the sponsors. So there was a lot of interest in this from the outset, and it was good context. Now, when the CCA is referred a question such as this, it is asked for a sober assessment of the relevant evidence and analysis of that evidence. And in doing so, we put together an expert panel, and they are then asked to answer questions put to them by the sponsors. And in doing so, though, they are asked not to advocate, nor do they make recommendations. They answer the questions that have been put to them. And I think, so that's what you're going to hear today. You're going to hear what they've come to agree on in terms of the evidence and how best to answer the questions. So finally, this is a multidisciplinary panel that has carried out their work over the span of about a year, from mid 2023 to mid 2024. And during this time, they met multiple times in person, virtually, and their job was to identify all the relevant evidence they could get their hands on. And ultimately to assess all of that. And as I said, to reach an agreement, reach consensus on what it all means in the context of the answers that have been asked. And again, no recommendations. And it's ultimately to support conversations such as these and to really help decision makers say, okay, this is where we're at. How do we move on next? And of course, their work completed in 2024, mid 2024. So any developments since then have not been considered in the report. What you're here today, what you're going to hear about today. So then, let me begin with some introductions. We are very grateful to have with us today the chair of the expert panel, Dr. Wendy Rogers. There we are. Wendy, you're behind me. And of course, Wendy Rogers is the president and vice chancellor of the University of Prince Edward Island. And when Dr. Rogers agreed to take this on, she had yet to assume her current responsibilities. And so we are ever more grateful for your time today and for your ongoing support for the work that you and your panel did. So thank you. Thank you, Betty. Et nous sommes également reconnaissants d'avoir parmi nous l'un des membres du panel en tant que modérateur de la discussion aujourd'hui. Bienvenue, professeur Mavlikis, professeur de génie mécanique ici à l'Université d'Ottawa. Over to Catherine.
So I guess we can get started with the presentation. How are we doing this?
Oh, if I may, just before, one more thing. For those of you who are interested, we have a couple of materials summarizing the report at the very back. These 2 products here, and by all means, make yourself, pick them up on your way out. With that, sorry, Catherine, go ahead.
Well, thank you for those introductions from the 3 of you. I'm pleased to be part of this afternoon discussion. Wendy was our fearless leader in the year-long panel meetings. We also have people from the CCA here, Anita Melnick and Tazia, who helped us very much with the whole process and writing the report. So without any further ado, I'll let Wendy get started on our presentation.
Okay, hello, everybody. Sorry I can't be there with you in Ottawa today. As it turns out, it's a snow day here in Prince Edward Island, so the likelihood of me making it was low anyways. So thanks for mentioning all of the purpose of the panel, Tace. And the panel, although we were charged with summarizing all of the information we could find, and I need to mention it was really the CCA colleagues that found all of the information that we summarized, and we did give them extensive lists to look for. we did push up as hard as we could against making recommendations. And thank you, Dr. Ibrahim, for your comments. And I think it's interesting that, I mean, I started the panel off as a chair from an administrative position, and a few other people did as well, thinking it's really important for us to be able to use all of this information on a day-to-day basis. And so now hopefully I'm able to walk the talk a little bit more strongly than otherwise might be possible from my current position. So just making sure that everybody's aware that I'm reporting what the summary of what the panel found for the CCA project that we completed. And then Catherine is here as well, so thank you, Catherine. We can report on some of the things that the panel thought about what we were finding, and then really excited to have this opportunity because it's all of you that are going to be able to carry this work forward in important ways and take it to the next steps. Because as you will see, we identified weaknesses and gaps and needs, and hopefully that is driving the community to try to address the weaknesses, gaps, and needs, and also carry forward the very positive points that turned up as well. So moving on, I guess we'll just get going. So next, please. So this was the charge that we received from all of the federal councils that Tace mentioned. So we were to summarize the state of the knowledge regarding the measures, and by measures, we're thinking of interventions or things that people or organizations did in Canada and around the world and their effectiveness in achieving equity, diversity, and inclusion in the research ecosystem. Next, please. And then the sub questions was basically around the effectiveness of the measures to address underrepresentation. And we did our best to try to get that from the perspective of those groups. And then what existing measures have shown to be most beneficial to individuals who self-identify with multiple underrepresented and marginalized identities, so intersectional identities, and how are we implementing intersectional EDI measures. Next, please. So this is our panel. And so Tace already mentioned that it's interdisciplinary, but it was also selected to represent all the regions of the country and as much other diversity in people's expertise in their institutional positions and other aspects of diversity that we could tell, not specifically asking for any invitations. So the way the invitations go out, they call us up one by one and invite us to be part of the panel with no knowledge of who else is being invited or who else has or has not accepted the invitation to serve on the panel. And so for this particular panel, we all discovered that everybody was equally hesitant around, well, this could go really badly, and what will these conversations be like? And we really hope that we can use this to advance our knowledge in this area and push the area forward. And everybody agreed because they thought it was too important not to. So they all came together. And then I do have to say that it was really remarkable to be a part of the panel. And I'm thankful to every single individual for coming to the panel with a certain vulnerability, humility, curiosity, and respect, so that we were able to really dig into some topics and include all the voices. And it turned out to be, as far as I know, quite a positive experience for everybody on the panel. And we were grateful for having been included, and everybody acknowledged that not every forum where you are able to discuss these kinds of issues turns out that way. And so that, I would say, is just a little observation I'll share from the beginning, that our ability to create an inclusive forum to discuss all of these topics is really critical in moving towards even understanding what is available and what can be done to address EDI in our organizations. So thanks, panel. Next, please. So Tace already told you a lot of these details, but we met several times. We sent the CCA staff off to find more and more literature for us to review. They also did fabulous jobs of summarizing that. And then we looked at all of that from our own perspectives and did our best to include it as we moved along. Next, please. So a little bit of the context that we knew going in that I'm sure all of you are very, very familiar with as well is that the post-secondary research system is not representative of the Canadian population. And the more advanced we get through the post-secondary research system, it's not representative of the entry levels to the system either. There are barriers that persist or ceilings and walls that persist despite ongoing EDI efforts. There is overall a lack of disaggregated data, particularly on race and disability, which limits our ability to even look at the presence or the experiences of individuals with these experiences or identities and try to address them. But that the EDI measures, by which again we mean interventions, are evolving positively, I would say, in Canada. Next, please. We did spend some time talking about definitions of equity, diversity, and inclusion. I won't go into detail here. I'm sure that the group assembled is quite familiar with a wide number of definitions, and these are evolving as well. But just to say that words are important, and we do need to be clear about what it is that we are addressing when we use these words. Next, please. So the measures that we look at, and so the CCA colleagues did a great job of preparing these little schematics of how everything worked together. But you can see in the center here that a lot of the measures were around data collection, resources, various critiques, research funding, policies, and communities. And then they were deployed in ways to influence overall institutions, research processes, faculty members, staff, and students. And so we looked at all of these different kinds of interventions as they came forward, and we did try to summarize them with respect to the impacts that they could have on each of these areas. We did spend a little bit of time on the research processes just because of the nature of the sponsors for this particular report. So that we could encourage more inclusive research and scholarship going forward, as we think that that's critical to our sector. Next, please. So the findings, so we'll just go into a series of slides on what the general findings were. So measures that were accompanied by accountability, transparency, and enforcement mechanisms tended to produce meaningful changes in the research institutions. So one of the measures that we discussed a great deal and we think finally was effective was the changes to the Canada Research Chairs program in identifying systemic problems with its own distribution. So there's a little timeline across the bottom there describing the Canada Research Chairs program. And we note that a lot of the changes that were introduced to that program were influenced by a human rights tribunal finding and a legal finding that the panel had not been equitable in the distribution of the research, or the program had not been equitable in the distribution of the research chairs across Canada, particularly to women and other other marginalized groups. And there was an exclusively male cohort, which led to interventions from the Canada Research Chairs program that included metrics, that included specific instructions and timelines, and that included specific consequences for failing to reach the metrics, which encourage the institutions to go forward. So I will go into just a little bit of a personal experience here, because we know that when we first started these interventions, there was quite a bit of pushback suggesting that really the process had been fair until now, and that few women or persons of color or Indigenous persons or persons with disability had received Canada Research Chairs because they simply, or their scholarship simply was not good enough, or they had not quite met the standard. And yet once the targets had been put in place, lo and behold, there were plenty of those individuals who could achieve the standards of the Canada Research Chairs program, and the chairs were subsequently distributed more equitably across the eligible population. So these characteristics are critical to the success of some of the measures. And as we will go through some of the findings and going back to the main one about data, a lot of the interventions did not include extensive enough criteria or intended impacts or the metrics associated with those impacts in order to assess their success. Next, please. Leadership and organizational structures also play a key role in building equitable, diverse, and inclusive post-secondary institutions. And it is noted that leadership's commitment did tend to be associated with the success of the intervention. So it's insufficient to simply say the words and then deploy maybe a single individual to go off and address whatever the equity concern was or the inclusion concern was in the institution, that there needed to be strong involvement from the leadership of the institution, and where that took place, the interventions were more likely to be successful. It's also noted that allocating financial and administrative resources, not shockingly, resulted in greater success of the programs and strategies. Next, please. So an example here being the Dimensions program, it was to create capacity building grants and accreditation initiatives to move beyond diversity and to cultivate inclusion. So plenty of the early efforts to encourage EDI were actually diversity initiatives, so that institutions tried to do more about hiring more individuals that represented areas or communities that were underrepresented in whatever that institution was. And then they didn't do anything to ensure that those individuals were included in the activities of the institution or had any sense of community once they came there. So an example of this is the Dimensions program. So the Dimensions program was designed to create a more inclusive environment for women in particular. And it started off as a pilot program. It did not have sufficient assessment and metrics associated with it. It did receive quite positive feedback from institutions, and particularly women in institutions, and then it just ended. And we do note that just in October, a new phase of Dimensions was just announced. And I always just, rather cheekily, I guess, mentioned that the new phase of Dimensions was announced just a few weeks after we met with NSERC and the other tri-councils to tell them about the results of our program. So it could just be a coincidence, but just noting that for everybody. Next slide, please. We do need additional research to determine what measures are beneficial to people who self-identify with multiple underrepresented identities, so intersectional research and people with intersectional identities. We are not collecting adequate data, and a suggestion that the panel had was that a place the funding agencies and institutions could play a role is in collaborating on what kind of data are collected, so that we could start to have more consistent data collection across agencies and across the country that would help us to benchmark better, and then look at the effect of even local interventions on certain members of the communities, so that we could expand that out in more targeted ways. It does remain the case that certain disciplines, certain institutions, and certain regions of the country show different challenges with diversity and inclusion, and therefore we might want to tailor our interventions according to whatever the specific gap is in our discipline, in our institution, or in our region. Next slide, please. We did spend some time talking about resistance to EDI measures and to indigenization and decolonization and how those played out. So all members of the panel had different stories about the kinds of pushback that they had received that would range from specific individuals challenging other individuals about their own position on EDI, or even their own presence in the institution, and also institutions saying that they were in support of something and then not actually resourcing whatever the intervention was well enough in order for it to be successful, or cutting off interventions too soon so that it was not possible for them to achieve what their intended outcomes were. And a lot of this plays out as individual experiences within institutions, which affects perceptions of belonging and inclusion in institutions. And some of the pushback against EDI measures are sufficiently uncomfortable to threatening that even members of the panel didn't want to relay their own specific stories for fear that they could be identified later, and that might incite some sort of retaliation. So we still live in a situation where a lot of the pushback is so individually targeted that it's difficult to counter with institutional measures, driving us toward the need to make sure that the institutional implementations are strong enough that it can undermine the individual level pushback and allow for it to be called out or addressed through its own policies and other mechanisms available in the institutions. Next, please. So actions that support sustained EDI work in the face of these kinds of challenges is acknowledging the interconnectedness of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and implementing not only measures that increase diversity, but also ones that explicitly seek equity and inclusion, which means building community. It means addressing what might be the particular challenges of individuals underrepresented in institutions, and understanding that institutions are not necessarily built for certain members of our community that did not traditionally have access to them, and taking actions to be more encouraging and more inclusive of those kinds of individuals. So a really easy example would be for supporting women through childcare or opportunities to take care of their young children if they have to, without making that a barrier to continued participation in the academy. And so I'm sure you can think of other examples to be more inclusive. Embedding EDI offices and positions into the institutional structure. When we use temporary measures or temporary funding or temporary resources to support these kinds of offices or insufficiently resource them, we do not tend to encourage people taking up this kind of work as a career. And of course, it makes the work itself precarious and difficult to maintain. And there will be those challenges as we go through the changes in the institutions to make sure that it is sustainable. We want to foster broad engagement and support for EDI initiatives among faculty members, staff, and students across the research system. So we don't want this to just be the work of only one or two people or one office, but we want to ensure that there's engagement across our institutions so that they are supportive of the implementation. And we do want to develop metrics and accountabilities to ensure compliance among individuals and institutions. So for example, we have seen some shifts in the application processes for federal level funding, and sometimes provincial and other levels of funding, for researchers to indicate what they are doing in order to be more inclusive in whatever their research disciplinary area is, and especially in the training of their highly qualified personnel. But there's seldom actually a requirement to demonstrate that they had achieved any of those outcomes when it comes to the next time around for the funding. So if they said they were going to do more to increase the diversity of their trainees, there's seldom a look back on that and accountability structure to ensure that they actually did it. Next, please. So just a little bit of a summary is that we want to make sure that the approaches are interconnected and mutually reinforcing, and not necessarily single little projects distributed across an institution, or even one or two little projects within a big institution. Consider the complex ways in which people experience exclusion, that they're multi-level in their implementation, and they have consistent and long-term support. That they include transparent and flexible compensation systems. We didn't mention this, but there's plenty of institutions that have opportunities to adjust their compensation systems that are not widely known, to which there is not a consistent or fair access and are not consistently applied. That results in differential compensation based on usually gender, but also other characteristics as well. That leadership must be involved in key roles, and they have to do more than speak to the need to address EDI, and need to be involved in it and role model it themselves. That it's implemented throughout the research process. I just gave you an example of that we award a grant on the basis that a researcher is going to be more inclusive in their processes, then we need to, at the next possible stage, assess whether or not they have in fact implemented the promises that they made, and include accountability and transparency and enforcement mechanisms. Next, please. So the panel reflections was that EDI initiatives have led to transformative changes within Canada, although I would argue that they are not consistently so. There are different examples of very good interventions, but sometimes they have not extended even across the institution in which that good example sits. There is a need for structured and consistent approach to identifying and addressing gaps in initiatives. And one of the ways that we would suggest pursuing that is through the collection and analysis of data in a consistent way across organizations and across the country. And to fully address EDI in Canada's post-secondary research system, a comprehensive examination of indigeneity in its own right needs to be pursued. I will mention at the very beginning, the panel did a self-assessment and noted that nobody on the panel self-identified as Indigenous, and even so, one Indigenous person on the panel would not be sufficient to look at indigeneity in the post-secondary research system. And the panel did make that one very strong recommendation that there should be another assessment that looks at indigeneity across the research ecosystem in Canada. Next, please. And that's the end of our summary.
Thank you very much, Wendy, for that comprehensive review of a very thick document. You spent a long time researching during the year. So we're going to move to our remarks from our two invited guests. I'm going to start with Drayton, Linda Bigweep, who is with us today as the CEO of the Novus Group, which is an innovation firm. We try to help companies connect with younger people, is what I think I read on your website. So from your point of view, do you have any initial reactions to what was presented?
Yeah, thank you again. Thanks to Monica, to ISSP for this opportunity to hear from what great research is being done in the EDI space. I briefly read the report. I almost got through all of it. But from what I saw, I think the main point that I want to bring back to is the data component. I think in the work that I do with different companies, it always comes down to that. It's what we keep pushing. It's what the world is going to revolve around more of. But at the same time, like Dr. Ibrahim was mentioning, I think in the post-secondary space in particular, there needs to be more of that. We need to know what we don't know. We need to understand and be able to analyze and see more of that. But in particular, I think also the speed. I think there's a thing of how fast we can make that happen. And yeah, that's really what I want to touch on, like the speed at which we're able to collect and analyze that information and make decisions on and make recommendations on is what's going to be crucial for the upcoming years. And this is really, it's going to be pushed by the idea that like the private sector is really, really good at this. And they're able to collect so much information, and they've kind of established this level of control because they have so much information. And an interesting example, which I know that we're all thinking about, is our neighbors down in the US. With Trump coming into presidency, I was reading something interesting about Meta, the platform, and some of their decisions surrounding how they're going to go about this kind of like releasing some of the measures they had to put into place for fact checking. So I think they fired some of the people that were on the fact checking committees and stuff. And what that's going to do is obviously release a lot of like disinformation on the platform. But even greater than that, like you have now a platform that's going to be filled with even more data that's not necessarily representative of what's reality. And from that, like a lot of other companies and institutions use their information to make decisions, to create things, to create applications. And obviously with the rise of AI, like it's, AI is being built on these data sets that are filled with misinformation, and that can affect a lot of the way we go about our everyday lives and whatnot. So I think post-secondary is institutions are in this place where it's very diverse. Although the data doesn't show it, post-secondary institutions are full of diversity. They're full of people from all around the world that are coming to study. So it's an opportunity almost for post-secondary institutions to collect and analyze this information. And because of the way that there's connections that are being built between like these institutions and like governments, for example, if we're able to collect that information and analyze it at a faster pace, we can make those recommendations to the governments and maybe put things in place that can help kind of keep the balance between what the private sector is doing with their information and their data. And then also there's obviously the opportunity of working directly with the private sector and using the information that we're collecting with our practices and with the policy that we have in place, because we know that like we're thinking about EDI, we're thinking about all these things we want to do, and then hopefully then make some of those platforms or those things in the future more EDI friendly, and having that aspect in mind as well. Yeah.
I think I could bring something up, but you mentioned, Dr. Ibrahim, that we don't have a collection process. I think we had one when we were part of the Dimensions program. Count me in, but again, to keep that up to date every year is difficult. And so, and part of the Count Me In also was something where you self-reported. So I think some of the problems around data collection are, is it ethical to ask everybody to report or to label them in some way? Because some people, I meet a lot of students who are from other countries and they don't see themselves as belonging to some of these marginalized groups. It doesn't occur to them because that's not, when they came from their country, they're the majority group, right? So do you think there's, and then you talk about Meta and private sector who are maybe collecting data, unbeknownst to us, which we don't appreciate either. And do you think there's a disconnect between generations? So the younger generation seems to not worry about all this data collected on them, and older generations do.
That's an interesting question. I was reading something recently that just off of like social media, that people, the younger generation just doesn't seem to care about this information as we collected. They just want to like consume their content and not like leave them alone. So I think there's definitely a disconnection because we're so used to so much information being put at us and like being used for us to consume. There was like this running joke that your phone here's what you want to buy and stuff. So when you say something and randomly you just see ads popping up, but a lot of younger people use that like to their advantage. They always just randomly say stuff and like I want to buy this, and then randomly they see it on their phones. So I think like we're going in a world where it's almost impossible to not have like your data used for like a certain purpose. I think it's just how if like getting ahead of the curve and being able to set those standards ourselves in terms of like what's ethical to collect and how we want to make that collection happen and how do we want to make that analysis happen. But I don't think there's a world where we don't use information. I just think you have to set those practices in place beforehand.
Thank you for those remarks. Our second person to provide some remarks is online. It's Gregor Beutling, who's coming to us from Germany. Hopefully gets on the screen here. Oh, there you are.
Yep, there I am. Okay, so then I will start. I try to use your timer, so hopefully this all works.
Can I say a couple words?
It's obvious for that the whole EDI process is highly important for disabled people, not just in the education system, but of course everywhere. For example, you can see there's a lot of pushback during the emergency in Los Angeles to have sign language interpreters right, in the emergency meetings. I mean, what we are doing has impacts everywhere. This is for disabled people, the EDI process. This is not just, I mean, the workplace or how we learn. And so, right, so this is what we do is therefore very important. And when the report states training and resources are required to facilitate full participation to empower people with disabilities with greater self-determination and self-advocacy as measured of improved inclusion is of course also very important. But for all of that, you need EDI literacy, how it relates to disabled people, and also with that then to see where the action gaps are. And that is much less evident. And I just come now with a few points. One is really simple, the very identity of disabled people. Whether it's StatsCan, whether it's the CSE research chair, whether it's a definition in the report, you define disabled people by default as defective products because you use impairment and impairment of body-mind. Right? So if you're talking about self-determination, think about yourself. If your very identity is preset, right, like I would say women are double X syndrome, right? That by itself already leads to all kinds of issues. And there are ways that you can ask, I mean, set up demographic questions that people can really identify how they are. Are there a variation or are they really seeing themselves as impaired? Or right, even where the disablement originates, the body, mind, or the society, or both. Indeed, when the report says, when they're talking about people with disabilities, and then they say, for example, people with disabilities, people in the LGBTQ2S community, and neurodivergence people. This is problematic because neurodivergence people are people with disabilities. Why this difference? If you use neurodivergence, then you should also use cognitive divergent, Audi divergence, deaf culture, sensory divergence, mobility divergence, and even ability divergence. Why this special treatment? You're pitting, therefore, in this way, disabled people against each other, and that is definitely not good for self-determination. The other one is the very number of disabled people. Well, StatsCan says we are 27%. According to StatsCan report on faculties, they're saying self-identification is 6.7%, but even the 27 is too low when you're really looking at what all counts as disability, right? 1 in 5 Canadians have a mental illness, right? There you can calculate. Then we have 8 million have chronic pain, 3 million, right, have diabetes. 15 to 20% have a language-based learning disability as impairment. And so you're going on and on. If you look at everything which is covered under the label disability, I mean, literally you have to say we're 60 to 70% of the population, right? I mean, there's obviously much more. Right. The next issue then is accessibility. Accessibility, the most important one is attitudinal one. And that is missing in the definition of the report. It just talks about physical and digital. Then the next thing, you're talking using terms like anti-racism, but we don't use terms like anti-disableism, right? We're given, right, I mean, which would be then, right, I mean, acting against disableism, which is, right, which is, I mean, the action to use irrelevant ability expectations or ableism by an individual or social structure, right, to, in essence, disable the others. Right, so the language is not strong. The report talks about that the metrics, although the benchmarks are lower because they assume so many people will not disclose, but we do not show the numbers. Indeed, StatsCan did this for faculties, and for disabled people, harassment was 37% and unfair treatment 47%. Where's the music coming from? Is this from me? No. Okay, right. So even that, the harassment, we don't show the numbers because the disabled people are the ones with the highest number of harassment and unfair treatment in the education system. far beyond, other groups, and we never use these numbers. And so it goes on. So without all these terms and the literacy, that people know even what the reality is and what the language means, it makes it very hard for to make EDI throughout the universities, whole in Canada, in a cohesive fashion, really working for disabled people. And I think I'm done with my 5 minutes here.
Well, thank you. It was very difficult, I have to say, on the panel we argued about the word disabled, even not using that word at all. So you work in this space, you seem to be comfortable with that word. I'm wondering, are there other better words than that? And maybe you could tell us a bit about what you do at the University of Calgary in this space, because I don't see many universities having a position such as yours.
Well, obviously we were part of the dimension process and we generated a lot of, recommendation what has to be done. One of the main ones was, for example, we need affinity groups. We have really no good process in place for disabled people to meet. Right? So everyone sits there by themselves in their little silo. Students might meet, faculty, there's no mechanism, and for staff, right, which is often totally, not in it, also don't have that. But we had, I don't know, over 200 different, 200 recommendations, what one can do over short term, middle term, long term. And, well, but it's all, it's whether it's Calgary or Ottawa or, other countries like here in Germany, it's very hard because the literacy around disability and who is what is very problematic. Certain things are even hard to solve. You're saying, well, we need disaggregated data. Well, if you have only one faculty in a wheelchair, for privacy reasons, you can never use that data because we all know who it is, right?
Yeah.
There's also certain real problems even when you want to go really, if you have so few of a certain group of disabled people, then you literally can't use their wisdom, definitely not in a write-up, because then everyone knows who they are. So, the privacy issues are definitely actually an issue because we have so few in many places. If you go for specific disabilities, like wheelchairs, there are very few on the faculty level, for example. The majority by now is mental health and learning disability. Right? And that also has consequences. Right? We're not talking about when I was a student, it was blind, deaf, wheelchair users, and so on. Now it's mental health. That's where the numbers are. And that must have an impact how a university even deals with it, right, around EDI. And so we have a knowledge hub at the UFC, which one can access. And on our presidential council, hopefully by the time the report is done, there will be then also concrete actions what's supposed to be done. But we have to see what it is. And then if everyone is responsible, we have to literally build the knowledge and the literacy of everyone, because if everyone is responsible, that also means everyone has to be literate first. Otherwise, they can't be responsible. So this is a huge task for everyone in Canada. I don't think there's really one university which is really so much better than another one. Right? We all have problems around disability, how the EDI process is, function, also the academic inquiry. Right? It's not that simple.
Okay, thank you very much. I have to apologize because I did not introduce Monica, who was also going to present something about what the ISSP has done in this space. So you can go ahead with that.
Well, what I'd like to suggest, just given the time, I see we have questions. I'm sure there are questions in the room. So why don't we turn to those? All I will say is that the EDI or the ISSP has completed a report on equity, diversity, and inclusion in teaching, research, and knowledge mobilization at the Science Society Policy Interface. Great report, please read. What we can do then is circulate a link to that report to everybody in attendance so you can have a look at it for yourselves. But for now, Catherine, I think it would be best for us to just move to questions so people who have something to ask about have an opportunity.
Okay, so we have a question from Andrea Stewart from the CAUT. CAUT was involved in the Canada Research Chair Program complaint to the Human Rights Commission has a history of supporting EDI efforts. The question is, today's presentation seems to have as a basic assumption that EDI initiatives are valuable and important. However, the political tides in Ottawa are turning. There's an alarming increase of anti-EDI rhetoric in Ottawa and is consistent with similar rhetoric from the US. Is there advice or thoughts in the room on how best to advocate for EDI work, or to show the return on investment, or to counter the narrative that EDI work is anti-excellence? Do we open to the floor, or do we open to the?
I'm inclined to open to our speakers. Folks in the room will have an opportunity to connect on some.
How about, should
issues.
we bring back Wendy?
I think that's a
Wendy,
great
would you
idea.
like to say something
Yeah.
about that?
So I don't know who all is in the room, so it's hard for me to say. I'm sure that there's others in there that have very good ideas about this. I think, yes, we are starting from a basic assumption that EDI is important, not from its own right, but because if we are more inclusive, diverse and equitable, we will have stronger societies, stronger institutions, better ideas, better solutions, and reduce problems and increase quality of life, I would say, in general. So it's not just about the metrics and achieving EDI. How can we push back? I would say by developing those kinds of arguments, but also I think in a little bit to Gregor's points, we're starting from an institutional standpoint and understanding that our report just reviewed the literature available around the post-secondary ecosystem, and not even all of that, more focused on research. We're starting from a point that was never inclusive in the first place. So there's all kinds of work to do about language and about how buildings were constructed and how we think about how we deliver education and how we assess learning through exams and so on. All kinds of things need to be assessed. And I imagine that that's overwhelming for lots of people. And if the people that are invested in whatever that foundational place was in the beginning, which was hundreds of years ago in certain countries, not in Canada, but in other countries, then they might see some of that as a threat. So some of the pushback from EDI comes from a weakening, partly because everything was so narrow, including the kinds of science and scholarship we could pursue, that as soon as you start to evolve that out, and then people can see that as a dilution as opposed to an enrichment. And I could talk about that just from my personal standpoint quite a long time, but we're tight for time, so I'm not going to. But I would say that we do have to develop those arguments based around strength, inclusion, quality of life, and overall making the world a better place would be where we have to start from there.
Great, and I'd like to get your point of view from a younger perspective. I think a lot of young people don't see a lot of issues often with EDI because they're living it. But then as you get into an organization, then you start to see the problems. Similar experience I had when I was younger. What do you think if we don't have institutions leading the process? Do you think it can happen as a generation grows up, or the grassroots effort?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a grassroots standpoint, there's always like a lot of efforts that are being done. There's a lot of organizations that are coming up and that are kind of building some of those efforts. But I think, you know, if the institution is always like the important piece, because that's where usually the funding comes from. That's where you get the money to do the work. So I think if there isn't that change on an institutional level, there's going to be that ceiling eventually. There's going to be a certain level where they can get to achieve a certain point. For example, you know, with this local government, there was a lot of funds allocated to like Black organizations, and a client of ours is in the space, and you know, they're kind of at this spot where they think they're going to get that funding, but they're not sure. So there's a lot of like anxiety on what happens next with all this work that's already been in place, that's put in place. So for them, it's like, there's so much work that's been done and we can calculate what that ROI looks like. But who's gonna care about that, right? You know, like, they have the numbers, they have the data, but, if the institutions don't really care for that at that point, then it doesn't matter, so.
Anybody else, any questions from in the room here? Gregor, did you want to? Oh, I see Wendy's hand is up.
Yes.
Gregor can go first.
I'm first, okay. Thank you. I would say we're saying, I mean, right, the young people don't see much of an issue with doing EDI. I still think even with the young people, a lot of them, their knowledge around disabled people and their lived reality is very poor. Right? I mean, many of them, I mean, as I teach this, when my students come in our own degree and they're literally by their history of their lived experience, hardly encounter disabled people. Right? So then if they never see them, how, and then they see it, for example, everywhere, the wheelchair sign on washrooms, right? And then they're thinking, hey, we do a lot of cool stuff. I mean, the washroom is everywhere, the wheelchair sign. Of course, the wheelchair sign at the washroom has no correlation with the reality of whether it's accessible, right? Right, and it goes on. I think this is right. I mean, they don't even know how bad it is, and our own students feel like when they're pointed out, people say, "What the heck are you talking about?" Because people because people have a totally different perception of reality, right, based on what they're exposed to and what they hear, than what actually the reality is around disabled people, right? And that's why I say, and if we never mention this harassment and unfair treatment, right, I seem to be the only one who constantly drags up these numbers from StatsCan, right? And they're from STEM or Lisa Meeks about physicians with disabilities. When you look at these numbers, right, the abuse you get, I mean, even as a person who makes it in the system, I mean, when you're a physician with disability, you're supposed to have made it, right? The same with faculty. And then you have 40% of the patients are abusing you, physically and otherwise. Right? I mean, and we never see these numbers, and the other students don't see it in the other courses if they're not in disability studies. Then you have a totally, I mean, right, a totally different. It's like Venus and Mars, right? Totally different. I mean, understanding what the reality is, and then you can't come together because you don't understand what the heck they're talking about, and that's for us the danger.
Thank you. Wendy?
We just quickly, I would say that there's a difference between advocacy and inclusion that we need to think about. And it's easier to do one than the other. And I would also suggest that we have to be careful about speaking about, which is advocacy, inclusion, diversity, and equity at the same time. So institutions sometimes speak out of both sides of their mouth in a way, because they speak about this, but at the same time as they are, for one reason or another, reinforcing privilege and entitlement through its policies and other kinds of agreements that affect how people behave and interact with each other. So we need to be really broad in how we are looking at what's going on in the entirety of our institutions.
Thank you. Any more questions? We have a few minutes left. I'll bring up another subject, perhaps. I guess at the root of the pushback to EDI, you have to wonder what people's motivations are for that. Personally, I think fear for some people, they're going to lose the privilege they have. I don't know, what do other people think is the root of that? And then if you can identify that, then you can maybe address people's reluctance, right? Anybody have an idea in that direction? Gregor?
Yeah, I mean, this is not based on the EDI, but I mean, in many countries you have, for employment, you have quota systems for disabled people. right? And of course, the pushback is literally was the same language, reverse discrimination, right? And you just get the job because you're in a wheelchair, not because you have any clue what you're doing. I mean, all of these are not new to disabled people. I mean, the same now we have now around other EDI groups has been applied to disabled people for a long time. And so I'm a little bit surprised that others are surprised that this kind of, I mean, this rhetoric, this narrative is so long, and disabled people still haven't found a way to counter that, because if people don't want, they come up with something, and then it's like you can come up with all kind of arguments. They just use this, and then in their little bubble now, and right, and you're not getting to these people. It's really unfortunate. I mean, we haven't found a way to counter this. People still see disabled people as, right, every country which has a quota system, they're still fighting, right, and treating disabled people, I mean, as if they get this purely because they're disabled, not because they actually could do the job and so on. Right? I mean, this thing is simply there for a long time, and we still haven't, here in Germany or in other countries, it's still the same narrative. It's literally only our savings that the government so far simply stick with it. But if the right certain political constellations are changing, then of course this is all on the chopping block.
I'll have this one question online here. I think as far as the student knowledge about EDI, the high turnover of students is a challenge, since you need to be constantly having those discussions, which feels redundant to professors. So we end up thinking the students have a basic knowledge greater than they do. And I have to say also, every year, the incoming students to this university, the demographic makeup changes from year to year, and they tell us that they're going to recruit in all sorts of different countries, that countries are shifting from year to year. So even more important to have the data every year. Anybody want to address that? Fact that we have to constantly be, is there a way to constantly be putting this on the radar of incoming people coming into the system, whether it be professors or students? Anybody in the room?
Drayton, you're a student, what do you think?
I mean, I guess from a student perspective, it's always like, I think we would love to know how diverse our institutions are and our universities. And I think we get a first-hand experience of that only if we take the step to like go and join clubs or be out and really get that experience for ourselves. But you know, if there was a way to have an idea of what that looks like and have that more presented by professors, by departments, I think, yeah, definitely would add value. And yeah, I do think through the whole data collection thing is definitely the way to go.
I'll just mention that the student who wrote in here took it upon herself to do the survey of the engineering faculty students, both undergrad and grad. And so she has posters all around campus. If you want to know about at least our faculty, what the makeup is and how people came to engineering. And you know, if you don't know an engineer, you're not gonna think about going into engineering, because it's not something people tell you about in high school and careers class. And a lot of people in high school don't even know what engineers are and what they are. But so kudos to Leah Christopher who did that. So I think, okay, we have a comment.
Yeah, Bob Walker here, senior fellow at the ISSP. Wow, is this a difficult subject? And thank you for stimulating that conversation. The last intervention though does just poses with me the question of why are universities so vested in EDI? And it seems to me it is about the fact that every year you're graduating 300,000 young Canadians that are the leaders of tomorrow. And that by instilling in those 300,000 Canadians, kind of the experiential learning around what is EDI and what does it mean to you, and how do you help bring those ideas forward as you go into society, you go into your professional careers, what have you. we're gonna be in a better place. So is it not about the fact that our universities are in the business of educating the next generations of leaders? And it's the physician heal thyself paradigm. If you can't show how your own institution is living, walking the talk, how can you expect students walking out of that institution to carry those ideas into their future? And so I understand entirely that the question posed to you through CCA came from the funders of the research apparatus. Good. I simply think it's perhaps a recalibration that what we have here is a fundamental need to change culture.
Yeah.
And universities are in a unique position because you touch a whole lot of people every year at that time when you're actually shaping their worldviews. But it can't be talking out of the side of your mouth. You have to show how you're living that reality in your own institution. So now, maybe that's a large point that you're making to Gregor. How do you make those lived experiences realities for more and more students to move forward? And while we have just such a rich need for these kind of conversations to occur, my sense is it's just a question of universities stepping up and saying, just as the theme seems to be, so many universities are saying the future is about experiential learning. How many times do I love it? Maybe a dimension of experiential learning is EDI. And to make that more explicit as an objective, but realizing you have to live it. Is that, how are you responding to it? Maybe Wendy, if you have a thought on that as well. I don't know if, this is certainly outside the remit of the study you were asked to do, but perhaps it's a question of the university sector taking ownership of the problem collectively as opposed to the granting council say take ownership of it. Thoughts?
I would say that it does go back to the structure of universities, which have essential components of privilege and entitlement that are self-reciprocating through its assessment methods, not so much of its students, but even of the grants itself. So how does science move ahead? Because it's those senior people coming backwards on the new ideas all the time, which is the same way that faculty and instructors are evaluated as well. And there's systems set in place to preserve privilege and entitlement, which is what the system was designed to do in the first place. And that takes a long time to turn, and it can be very difficult for people, including myself, that were brought up through that system of what constitutes excellence and what you have to do, and it's very exclusionary, so that you get fewer and fewer and fewer by the time you get to the top. And we also have the issue that the students are going through every 4 years, so 25% of the cohort changes every year of students, theoretically, on a 4-year undergraduate, but the professoriate turns over about every 25 to 30 years. So we have to keep our eye on it all the time because of those systems, and they take a long time to get the traction to come in. So we do need the assistance of the external bodies, and the external bodies are the ones with the money. And who are the ones with the money? They're the governments and the main funders, which are still associated with government. So that's why we need that help, I would say.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe I could just add some observations on that. I think it's interesting that this is coming from the research funding system for what is basically a national conversation, right? That goes well beyond the universities, but I think that's a unique feature of Canada insofar as we have this very centralized research funding system that has reached through to all the provinces, through the universities, which are major agents of cultural change, right? And I think that makes, this all the more important because this is where the leadership is coming from. It's coming out of the research system for Canada. And I think that's a feature of the system, not intentional, but that's how it is.
Okay, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time, so I want to thank Wendy and Gregor online and Drayton for participating in our conversation. And we'll wrap it up.
Yes, so yes, and thank you to you, Catherine, for that fantastic moderation of the panel. So just a quick heads up for folks online and in the room. Our next action dialogue is coming up at the end of February, on February 25th, looking at the topic of science diplomacy in an uncertain and geopolitically volatile world. So stay tuned for an invitation from us to that session. In the meantime, we wish you well, and we'll close off the online portion for today. Thank you so much for attending.